and neglect the broader strategy we need for a safer, more prosperous world. That's what our enemies want us to do. I believe in a smarter kind of American leadership. We lead best when we combine military power with strong diplomacy, when we leverage our power with coalition building, when we don't let our fears blind us to the opportunities that this new century presents. That's exactly what we're doing right now. And around the globe, it is making a difference. First, we stand united with people around the world who've been targeted by terrorists, from a school in Pakistan to the streets of Paris. We will continue to hunt down terrorists and dismantle their networks, and we reserve the right to act unilaterally, as we have done relentlessly since I took office, to take out terrorists who pose a direct threat to us and our allies. At the same time, we've learned some costly lessons over the last 13 years. Instead of Americans patrolling the valleys of Afghanistan, we've trained their security forces, who've now taken the lead. And we've honored our troops' sacrifice by supporting that country's first democratic transition. Instead of sending large ground forces overseas, we're partnering with nations from South Asia to North Africa to deny safe haven to terrorists who threaten America. In Iraq and Syria, American leadership, including our military power, is stopping ISIL's advance. Instead of getting dragged into another ground war in the Middle East, we are leading a broad coalition, including Arab nations, to degrade and ultimately destroy this terrorist group. We're also supporting a moderate opposition in Syria that can help us in this effort, and assisting people everywhere who stand up to the bankrupt ideology of violent extremism. Now, this effort will take time. It will require focus. But we will succeed. And tonight I call on this Congress to show the world that we are united in this mission by passing a resolution to authorize the use of force against ISIL. We need that authority. Second, we're demonstrating the power of American strength and diplomacy. We're upholding the principle that bigger nations can't bully the small by opposing Russian aggression and supporting Ukraine's democracy and reassuring our NATO allies. Last year, as we were doing the hard work of imposing sanctions along with our allies, as we were reinforcing our presence with the frontline states, Mr. Putin's aggression, it was suggested, was a masterful display of strategy and strength. That's what I heard from some folks. Well, today, it is America that stands strong and united with our allies, while Russia is isolated with its economy in tatters. That's how America leads. Not with bluster, but with persistent, steady resolve. You know, in Cuba, we are ending a policy that was long past its expiration date. When what you're doing doesn't work for 50 years, it's time to try something new. And our shift in Cuba policy has the potential to end a legacy of mistrust in our hemisphere. It removes a phony excuse for restrictions in Cuba, stands up for democratic values, and extends the hand of friendship to the Cuban people. And this year, Congress should begin the work of ending the embargo. You know, as His Holiness Pope Francis has said, diplomacy is the work of small steps. And these small steps have added up to new hope for the future in Cuba. And after years in prison, we are overjoyed that Alan Gross is back where he belongs. Welcome home, Alan. We're glad you're here. Our diplomacy is at work with respect to Iran, where for the first time in a decade we've halted the progress of its nuclear program and reduced its stockpile of nuclear material. Between now and this spring, we have a chance to negotiate a comprehensive agreement that prevents a nuclear-armed Iran, secures America and our allies, including Israel, while avoiding yet another Middle East conflict. There are no guarantees that negotiations will succeed, and I keep all options on the table to prevent a nuclear Iran. But new sanctions passed by this Congress at this moment in time will all but guarantee that diplomacy fails, alienating America from its allies, making it harder to maintain sanctions, and ensuring that Iran starts up its nuclear program again. It doesn't make sense. And that's why I will veto any new sanctions bill that threatens to undo this progress. The American people expect us only to go to war as a last resort, and I intend to stay true to that wisdom. Third, we're looking beyond the issues that have consumed us in the past to shape the coming century. No foreign nation, no hacker should be able to shut down our networks, steal our trade secrets, or invade the privacy of American families, especially our kids. So we're making sure our government integrates intelligence to combat cyber threats, just as we have done to combat terrorism. And tonight I urge this Congress to finally pass the legislation we need to better meet the evolving threat of cyber attacks, combat identity theft, and protect our children's information. That should be a bipartisan effort. If we don't act, we'll leave our nation and our economy vulnerable. If we do, we can continue to protect the technologies that have unleashed untold opportunities for people around the globe. In West Africa, our troops, our scientists, our doctors, our nurses, our healthcare workers are rolling back Ebola, saving countless lives and stopping the spread of disease. I could not be prouder of them. And I thank this Congress for your bipartisan support of their efforts. But the job is not yet done, and the world needs to use this lesson to build a more effective global effort to prevent the spread of future pandemics, invest in smart development, and eradicate extreme poverty. In the Asia-Pacific, we are modernizing alliances while making sure that other nations play by the rules in how they trade, how they resolve maritime disputes, how they participate in meeting common international challenges like nonproliferation and disaster relief. And no challenge poses a greater threat to future generations than climate change. 2014 was the planet's warmest year on record. Now, one year doesn't make a trend, but this does. 14 of the 15 warmest years on record have all fallen in the first 15 years of this century. I've heard some folks try to dodge the evidence by saying they're not scientists, that we don't have enough information to act. Well, I'm not a scientist either. But you know what? I know a lot of really good scientists at NASA and at NOAA and at our major universities. And the best scientists in the world are all telling us that our activities are changing the climate. And if we don't act forcefully, we'll continue to see rising oceans, longer, hotter heat waves, dangerous droughts and floods, and massive disruptions that can trigger greater migration and conflict and hunger around the globe. The Pentagon says that climate change poses immediate risks to our national security. We should act like it. And that's why over the past 6 years, we've done more than ever to combat climate change, from the way we produce energy to the way we use it. That's why we've set aside more public lands and waters than any administration in history. And that's why I will not let this Congress endanger the health of our children by turning back the clock on our efforts. I am determined to make sure that American leadership drives international action. In Beijing, we made a historic announcement. The United States will double the pace at which we cut carbon pollution, and China committed for the first time to limiting their emissions. And because the world's two largest economies came together, other nations are now stepping up and offering hope that this year the world will finally reach an agreement to protect the one planet we've got. And there's one last pillar of our leadership, and that's the example of our values. As Americans, we respect human dignity even when we're threatened, which is why I have prohibited torture and worked to make sure our use of new technology like drones is properly constrained. It's why we speak out against the deplorable anti-Semitism that has resurfaced in certain parts of the world. It's why we continue to reject offensive stereotypes of Muslims, the vast majority of whom share our commitment to peace. That's why we defend free speech and advocate for political prisoners and condemn the persecution of women or religious minorities or people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. We do these things not only because they are the right thing to do, but because ultimately they will make us safer. As Americans, we have a profound commitment to justice. So it makes no sense to spend $3 million per prisoner to keep open a prison that the world condemns and terrorists use to recruit. Since I've been president, we've worked responsibly to cut the population of Gitmo in half. Now it is time to finish the job, and I will not relent in my determination to shut it down. It is not who we are. It's time to close Gitmo. As Americans, we cherish our civil liberties, and we need to uphold that commitment if we want maximum cooperation from other countries and industry in our fight against terrorist networks. So while some have moved on from the debates over our surveillance programs, I have not. As promised, our intelligence agencies have worked hard with the recommendations of privacy advocates to increase transparency and build more safeguards against potential abuse. And next month, we'll issue a report on how we're keeping our promise to keep our country safe while strengthening privacy. Looking to the future instead of the past. Making sure we match our power with diplomacy and use force wisely. Building coalitions to meet new challenges and opportunities. Leading always with the example of our values. That's what makes us exceptional. That's what keeps us strong. That's why we have to keep striving to hold ourselves to the highest of standards, our own. You know, just over a decade ago, I gave a speech in Boston where I said there wasn't a liberal America or a conservative America, a black America or a white America, but a United States of America. I said this because I had seen it in my own life, in a nation that gave someone like me a chance. Because I grew up in Hawaii, a melting pot of races and customs. Because I made Illinois my home, a state of small towns, rich farmland, one of the world's great cities, a microcosm of the country where Democrats and Republicans and independents, good people of every ethnicity and every faith, share certain bedrock values.
The headlines at Press TV. The U.S. once again threatens Iran with President Obama saying all options are on the table against Tehran. He promises to veto new sanctions during talks with Iran. The United States Congress begins hearings on new anti-Iran sanctions after the International Atomic Energy Agency says Iran is honoring its commitments. And the Israeli media say Tel Aviv is cooperating with the Nusra Front terrorist group in the battle against the Syrian government. Hello and welcome live from Tehran. You're tuned to Press TV's World News. Thanks so much for being with us. First story this hour takes us to the United States, where President Barack Obama and Congress remain divided over new sanctions against Iran. Obama promises to veto anti-Iran moves while talks on Tehran's nuclear program is underway. Obama made the announcement during his State of the Union address to the nation. And the U.S. president said that all options remain on the table against Tehran, but he will veto any new bill that threatens to undo the dialogue's progress. A bipartisan group of senators is pushing a new round of sanctions despite the president's warning. Now, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's hearing on Wednesday on Iranian sanctions is the opening round of the new Republican-led fight with the White House.
So I know the good and optimistic.
And you're looking at those images coming out of Washington, D.C. The State of the Union address continues. We want to look at what has been said in detail with some guests. First of all, starting right here in Tehran, that we have a guest in the studio, managing partner of Global Growth Advisors, Mr. Rouzbeh Ali Abadi. Thank you so much for being with us. Well, let's look at a wide range of things we're talking about. So far for you, what you have heard, tell me the highlights in your perspective of this speech.
Marzi, this was one to the last State of the Union address by President Obama. The president focused on the domestic agenda. He focused on the economy. He said this is the first time the American job growth is looking more optimistic in over a decade. He also talked about a lot of other issues that concerns American people today. He talked about college education. He also talked about how he wants to cut college education and, in particular, community college cost for all Americans, which is up to 40 million people, and try to budget it with the new tax increase with cap gain and financial institution tax that he's going to put in place in the next decade or so to generate $350 billion.
All right, let me cross over to New York and get the founder of StopImperialism.com, Mr. Eric Dretzer, in on this. Eric, good to have you with us. Your take, some interesting moments with the State of the Union speech and almost a lot of cheerleading session. I want to look at the international side of things, especially when President Obama talked about talking about Americans and staying with American values. And he talked about, as far as the number of troops that have been lessened throughout the world, especially he looked at Afghanistan. And he talked about Americans standing for their values, that it's against torture, it's against Gitmo. I want your comments in general, your thoughts as far as what President Obama talked about, especially in dealing with these foreign events.
Sure. Well, I think it's probably productive to take a look at one of the most important quotes, I think, coming out of President Obama's speech. And specifically, he said, and I'll quote him, "Our values keep us exceptional," close quote. Now, what he's actually saying then is values really is a synonym for agenda, and exceptional is a synonym for we don't have to follow international law. That is to say, the United States is not bound by the rules that every other nation is bound by. And what's interesting precisely about that specific point is that he made precisely the inverse argument with relation to China and with regard to Russia and with regard to Iran. Specifically, the idea that it is these countries that do not play by international rules. It is these countries which are propagating some of the conflicts and fomenting conflicts around the world. But of course, as we know, this is an inversion of
respond to terrorism. I want to look at that word unilaterally. And basically, do you agree with our guest in New York says that it's saying basically that the United States can do whatever it wants whenever it deems necessary? How do you see it overall, sir?
I couldn't agree more with the gentleman in New York with what he said. But just to put this in context, this is the State of the Union is a political speech. That is, you're speaking to the audience of the American people. And of course, you see this silly conduct of probably every phrase, people stand up like kids and applaud. That's not a serious speech when people conduct it that way. But there's a couple of areas that really I found disturbing. With respect to Iran, first off, he's rightly so, the Congress, with the legislation to expand the sanctions, is crazy. They've gone stock raving mad. If they really understood the dynamics of the negotiations, they would realize that Iran has given in a great deal. And those negotiations could be ended right now with success for both sides. But it's the United States that's dragging this out, God knows for what effect, because it's not logical. The decision could be made right now. And of course, he repeated through inference that Iran would be seeking or is seeking a nuclear device. And that's not so. The evidence shows overwhelmingly that that's not so. And plus, your religious leaders have made it a matter of religion not to go into weapons of mass destruction, and particularly the nuclear.
Senator, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Let me just jump in here with something you've just said. When you talked about that actually an agreement could be reached today, I want to look at that. You said that you're not exactly sure why that doesn't happen.
We will veto it, but you're quite right. The Congress is reacting to the dictates of Tel Aviv, Israel, who finds the presence of Iran anathema. But that's not only, it's also Saudi Arabia that has weighed in here with Israel against arriving at something intelligent and safe for the world in the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia, be sure of this, Saudi Arabia is responsible for the last 50 years of inculcating Wahhabism into the children within the entire Islamic community and radicalizing a major portion of the Islamic community into jihadists. That is basically from Saudi Arabia, and that's our closest ally in the Middle East, and it's one we should be ashamed of. We talk about ISIS beheading Americans. Well, hell, it's a matter of course in Saudi Arabia that you behead publicly people, and now we've got a reporter who wrote the wrong article who's supposed to get 1,000 lashes. This is the country that says that Iran should not be equal in the nations.
Okay,
There's
Senator.
one thing that really disturbed me.
30
of what
seconds,
Obama
Senator.
said.
Sorry, 30 seconds, Senator, and I'll get back with you. But go ahead, make your last comment.
Okay. What disturbed me was when Obama said a war of last resorts. That was at the end of his treatment of Iran. A war of last resorts. Now, in a debate, I debated Obama when I ran for president, and I called him on that because he was making that pledge to AIPAC at an AIPAC meeting. And I told him that is absolutely dangerous. And so he just repeated that in his State of the Union.
Okay, well, I will look at that a little bit later in this discussion. I want to cross back over right here in Tehran, though, and get Mr. Ali Abadi back in on this. Looking at the economic side of things that he talked about, it was, again, as the senator said, a cheerleading session, sort of, with everyone breaking out in applause. But looking at the reality, on the one hand, there have been new jobs created over the last year. But if we look at the type of jobs that have been created, and if we look at salary-wise, it is much lower percentage-wise as far as the average salary of these new jobs. How does that affect the economy overall in the United States, your perspective?
Mazi, you're right. What has happened is, yes, the United States has created jobs, but you're right, the salaries remain flat. So what we're seeing right now, one of the things President Obama has talked about in the State of the Union and pledged to start changing it is to try to close this income gap that we're seeing in the United States. Right now, we're seeing a number of seasonal jobs have increased dramatically, but does this mean it's going to turn into permanent jobs? Well, that's going to be a different story. However, he also talked about our dependency on foreign oil in the United States. What we're seeing is there's going to be a lot more money in American pockets, families, in terms of cost savings, in terms of their gas prices and so on and so forth. However, one thing we have to remember is the president has been focusing on jobs. The president has been focusing on cutting costs, and it has resulted somehow in positive results. But this is the first time the president is facing a Republican majority or controlled House and the Senate. So he needs to make the case very clear. This is not about President Obama. Let's be very clear. This is about the race in 2016. So the president clearly in his speech, which is shorter than the other speeches he made, the previous 5 speeches he made, he's focusing on one thing, and that's to make sure that the Democrats are getting positive results for 2016 rates. Obviously, Republicans are not going to be happy about it. The president had some lofty ideas. They seem to be wonderful. However, the Republicans are not going to say yes to them right away. But on the economic front, at least the numbers, Wall Street, and what we've seen in Dow Jones, what we've seen in NASDAQ, what we've seen in the indices, we've seen some good numbers, and the president is taking advantage of those numbers at this point.
All right, crossing back over to New York, and Eric Dreitzer, your take, sir, looking at the domestic side of things and what President Obama talked about. It sounds like everything is basically back on track, as many people would say. But I want to look at the reality on the ground. When he talked about that there's no liberal America, no Democrat America, but one America. There's no black, there's no white, but it's the United States. The reality of that, as we're seeing, it appears more and more division, first from the economic perspective, as far as the percentage of those who have that 1% and the amount of money that they have, which has increased, and also the racial divide that we definitely saw so many examples of in 2014, and already in 2015 we're seeing more demonstrations on the ground. Your take, sir?
Well, there's a couple of points I would say in response to that. And I would first start out by noting that those two issues, that is to say the economic indicators, the economic health of the United States, and conversely, the situation of Black America, the situation of minorities in general, these things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they're quite connected. And Obama and obviously his speechwriters deliberately made sure not to draw out that connection, because were he to have drawn out that connection, he would have had to admit that Black America has an exponentially higher unemployment rate than the rest of America, that Black men have a lower life expectancy than the rest of America, higher infant mortality, lower rates of literacy, and countless other indicators that we could point to that show structural and institutionalized racism in the United States, not only from the political perspective, but also from the economic perspective. And Obama, throughout his national, at least political career, he has eschewed all forms of race politics. He won't even really mention Black politics, and he certainly doesn't consider himself as part of anything related to Black America or the Black political tradition. So he goes out of his way to avoid that issue. And obviously, I don't speak for Black America, but I would say that I would imagine that there are millions of Americans, African Americans right now, who are thinking to themselves, gee, I wonder why Obama didn't talk about us. I wonder why, in the wake of Ferguson, in the wake of all of these other incidents, the police shootings and everything else, in the wake of all of this, Obama can't be bothered to mention these specific issues, but rather encapsulates them all under this grand umbrella of one America. This is absolute nonsense. This is baseless and vacuous rhetoric that really is what the State of the Union passes for, as Senator Gravel mentioned there. And coming to these economic indicators, though, I think that this is also key. Notice that he mentions this program for community college and for funding people going to community college. And he even mentions, though he touches on it in a very sort of ambiguous way, this issue of student loans. But the question that I would have, and if I had an opportunity I would pose to Obama, is simple. If you're going to talk about student loans and you're going to talk about the hardships that young people face, how come you don't want to talk about the banks that own those loans? How come you don't want to talk about Wall Street? How come you don't want to talk about the financial criminals who are the actual economic parasites in this country? It's certainly not the debts-enslaved young people such as myself, for instance, who are so deep in the hole because they dared to pursue higher education and postgraduate education. He doesn't have a plan for these people. What he has is a general concept. Free community college. This is nonsense. Look at the specifics of his program proposal. There will be millions of people who will be disqualified from this program for everything from minor criminal offenses to background checks and who knows what else. You can go into all of the specifics of his actual policy prescriptions, and you find that they're all hollow, they are all empty, and they are all vacuous. And this is really what Obama is. And Obama is the empty vessel. That's what he was in 2008. That's what he was in 2012. The empty vessel upon which you're supposed to pour your hopes and dreams. But if you haven't woken up from the dream after 6 years, I fear you never will.
Okay, Senator Gravel, looking at what you had said when we were talking before about basically the threat at the end of Obama's part when he was talking about Iran itself. He talked about standing up for American values. If we look, though, at those values, we see throughout the world Americans being present militarily or basically trying to force countries to go along with him. He touched on Russia also, basically trying to break Russia economically. I want to look at America's role, really look at its role internationally, when at the end of that statement that he's talking about sanctions on Iran and on the one hand saying that he will not sign anything to increase his sanctions, but as you said, on the other side saying all options are still on the table, one, and two, war is not being ruled out. What does that say, though, about the true values of the United States?
It's an embarrassment in terms of our values. In fact, I saw a poll, and it really disturbed me, that 60% of Americans bought into the concept of torture. And that's, of course, because of Cheney and Obama and Bush all advocating this as a way to stop terrorism. It won't stop terrorism. And as you pointed out earlier, he's established American sovereignty over the world, that we will do whatever we want to do unilaterally. And let me touch a little bit about on Russia. That's an embarrassment also. We are the ones that are at fault in the Ukraine, not Russia. Nuland, the undersecretary, has stated publicly that America, and we continue this in other countries, has spent over $5 billion to destabilize the government of Kiev. And we did. We succeeded, and we dictated who their prime minister was going to be. Now, that's not Russia acting unilaterally in a bad way. It's us. And so our values, what we see in this entire speech, from the economic point of view, keep in mind, the success he's talking about is trickled down from Wall Street. Wall Street has done very well, but the gap between the rich, the super rich, and the average American is ever widening. And there's nothing being proposed to close that gap, and that is the fundamental problem that exists in the United States of America and worldwide. Worldwide. This isn't just us. And of course, the United States has criminalized and globalized the military-industrial complex through the use of NATO. NATO should be dissolved. It's not necessary, and there's no reason why Europe has to run around the world under our leadership, destabilizing legitimate sovereign countries. All I can say is that much of the speech is political and, in point of fact, jingoistic. Jingoism, where we Americans are better than everybody else and we should be concerned about our jobs. Well, as an American citizen with any sense of morality, you should be concerned about the jobs in Europe, jobs in China, jobs in the Middle East. Everybody has to have the opportunity to make a decent living, and that's not what we're contributing to. And I resent his statement that it's America that rolled back Ebola. China did more than we did with respect to Ebola in Africa. And well, they should, since they have a big investment there. But all I can say is this is a political speech that shows no change of values and no change in the sense of imperialism that America continues to exercise, not only with the president, but with the Congress. This is, and I'm sure with a lot of Americans who haven't really thought out the problems, that being the world policeman is something nobody can undertake unless we can have a world government that will be able to do this fairly and justly and apply it both to the powerful and to the weak at the same time.
Okay. Mr. Ali Abadi, looking at, again, back on the economic side of things, with the overall situation, Obama, I mean, it sounded, as I said, very, very positive. Do you think that the average American looking at the speech tonight, of course, over there, that they're going to feel encouraged, invigorated, and buy into this, that they believe it? Or do you think the average American will look really at their own lives and see exactly what's going on when the majority of Americans, especially young Americans under 40, owe so much in debt as far as their debts because of the student loans? So many of them have lost their homes, and it's very difficult actually to get back into that now because the qualifications are so difficult. Overall, how do you see it? I mean, you are an American. You lived in New York. Do you think Americans buy into this speech, or will they look at it in a different way?
Well, buying into speech is something, but we have to look at polls. But the polls that we're conducting prior to the State of the Union address by President Obama showed that the Americans' top priorities right now happens to be this widening of income gaps and the fact that wages have remained flat for over 3 decades. These are huge issues for President Obama. But most importantly, if President Obama and the White House are going to be looking at this more critically, they will try to pave the way for how the Democrats, how Obama's party will address these issues with the majority controlled by Republicans Congress, and try to see how they're going to make these fundamental changes. But something is very clear right now. Obviously, we're looking at the positive sides of the U.S. economy because of the oil prices. Sure, President Obama talked about the word dependency. He says our dependency on foreign oil is down. These are all good signs, but at the end of the day, you are right, Marzia. What's happening right now in the United States, the numbers, the indices are up, but as your other guests have talked about this issue. But if you look at the details in terms of proposal, for example, for cutting community college costs, but if you also look at how they're going to be raising taxes, but we're not seeing really good, detailed diagnosis and economic solutions. We're seeing more of a political speech, and that is not wasn't too far from expectations. The president right now is trying to boost up the party and get it ready for the presidential elections in 2016. So this was a political speech, and of course we did not see much of coherent economic diagnosis for the American people. But you're right, the wider problem, the larger problem, the more significant problem for the American economy remains the same, which is flattening wages for all Americans.
And back to New York, Eric Dretzer, when we hear President Obama talking about less dependency on foreign oil, and we look at the overall situation, what is happening in the world, and basically many would say an alliance with Washington and Riyadh and trying to break certain entities, whether it be Russia or be Iran or Venezuela. I want to look at that aspect of it. On the one hand, we see on the surface that Obama talks about various issues that is happening and trying to make it sound positive, but of course not looking at the international implications and the way that the United States can be very, very harsh and even try to destroy those on the other side.
Sure. Well, I think so as a way to introduce the idea of what the United States is doing, why don't we just take a look at exactly what Obama said? Let me quote him. I wrote it down as my jaw dropped to the floor. He said, quote, "Bigger nations can't bully the small," close quote. Now, I mean, the hypocrisy and the sort of aside, the laughable nature of such a statement aside, I think that there is an important point here, and that is that the United States, along with its allies, is doing precisely that with regard to the oil price. If you take a look at the statements from Saudi Arabia, from some of their high-ranking officials, you can see quite clearly that they're acting against their own economic interests by not decreasing production, by keeping these prices low through the always acknowledged unfair lever of OPEC. So the reality is the United States is using its leverage to do precisely what he said is not supposed to be done, and that is bully other nations. Now, he was talking about Russia with regard to Ukraine, and I just want to point out something for people who maybe didn't have the stomach to watch this nonsense on television. The issue of Russia and the U.S. aggressive policy in Ukraine was the only issue that I noticed, the only issue where you had total bipartisan support, standing up and applauding and cheering. Now, what does that tell you about the political establishment in this country, that the single most dangerous policy, the single most dangerous course that the Obama administration and the U.S. government has taken internationally, I mean, of course, confrontation with Russia, that is what is most heartily supported by the establishment. It's exactly as Senator Gravel said. This is the kind of jingoism, right? It's not patriotism. It is an extreme and belligerent and bellicose jingoism that takes root in the United States and in the political culture.
All right, Eric Dretzer, thank you so much. We're out of time. Founder of StopImperialism.com out of New York. Appreciate you being with us. Also, Senator Mike Gravel out of San Francisco, and Managing Partner, Global Growth Advisors, Mr. Roozbeh Ali Abedi. We appreciate you all being with us. And as always, viewers, we thank you so much for staying tuned to us right here at Press TV. Don't go away. I'll be back briefly, less than 2 minutes, with the news in brief. Stay tuned, please.
The unique treasury of National Jewels. It is one of the most valuable jewelry collections in the world, which has been gathered over the course of centuries.